Thank you for joining me today for Champaign-Urbana Jewish Federation's Holocaust Education Center podcast series. I am joined today by Erez Cohen, the Executive Director of Hillel here at the University of Illinois. Erez was born and raised in Tel Aviv and has a BA in Political Science and an MA in Diplomacy from Tel Aviv University. He has several stories of survival from ancestors who escaped the atrocities of the Nazis. Thank you so much for joining me today, Erez.
Elizabeth, first of all, thank you for working with the Holocaust Education Center to put this podcast on. New media formats appear, it is so critical that our stories adapt with them. And I hope that more people step forward to share their family stories from the Holocaust, knowing that there are easy and simple venues for doing so. Thank you.
It is my honor to be a part of this. Your professional experience includes working in a community center in Tel Aviv. You volunteered as a project manager in East Africa, serving as the Israeli fellow at UIUC Hillel. How did you go from all of your education and work experience in Israel to living in Champaign-Urbana?
It was a pretty easy transition to fall in love with Champaign-Urbana, with its loving Jewish community and really vibrant life here. I came to the United States. My first station was Champaign-Urbana in 2009 to bring Israel to campus and the campus to Israel, and really got involved with a wonderful Jewish community that made me want to come back. Worked here for 3 years, and thankfully a year after leaving, we had the opportunity of coming back for me to be the director of Hillel at the University of Illinois.
It doesn't sound like it was difficult to convince your wife Dana to move here to Champaign-Urbana.
Not at all. As a twice an alum of the university and having your family nearby in Chicago, it was an easy yes. And we have all been growing both as a family and individual ever since.
Well, we're glad to have you here. You have stories of 3 of your 4 grandparents who fall under the definition of having survived the Holocaust. Would you like to start with the history of your father's mother? That was more of a traditional Holocaust survival story.
Sure. When we are calling this a traditional Holocaust story, it has to do with the timeline, the locations, and we'll talk about that more. My father's mother was born in Krakow, Poland, to a Hasidic family. Her grandfather was Rabbi Shem Klingberg, who was one of the great Kabbalistic scholars in Krakow at the time. He had 10 children and 17 grandchildren by the time the Nazis invaded Poland in September of 1939. My grandmother spent time hiding in a town outside of Krakow and then moved into the ghetto and joined the Jewish resistance. They had one major battle against the Nazis before they got caught, and she was sent to Auschwitz, where she survived 2.5 years. After the war, she joined the British unit as a translator while they were searching for Nazi officers to bring to trials on war crimes. So on one hand, not very traditional. My grandmother was really a hero in the family. She lived a very interesting life in that period, very tough life in that period. But with that, it's traditional in the sense that she was in Poland. The war started in Poland in 1939. She was in Krakow, which is also the setting of the movie Schindler's List and Schindler's Factory. She ended up in Auschwitz, which has become the symbol of slave labor camp and death camps. And so from that perspective, a lot of her story has to do with places that we already know, already heard of. And from that point, there's a feeling of familiarity with the story of the Holocaust.
When she was liberated, and I would like to hear the story of how she got liberated, can you tell me the story of how your grandmother eventually found freedom?
So she wasn't actually liberated from Auschwitz itself. She took part in what is known to be the death marches. Basically, the Nazis were marching anyone who could walk and work towards Germany to try to keep that slave labor workforce working for the Nazis towards the end of the war. She ended up being liberated from a camp near Germany where a group of British officers were going through and looking for translators. Our family from Krakow was very educated. My grandmother spoke Yiddish, Hebrew, Polish, German, French, and English, and was able to join this British unit to basically translate wherever they went throughout Europe. She was able to identify several people from Auschwitz and bring them to trial and bring them to justice. And at the end of a year of traveling through Europe, she moved to see family that was still alive in London. And from there, she made Aliyah to Israel, where she met my grandfather, married him, had my dad and his sister, and the rest is history.
How did you find out about her ordeal? How old were you? And do you remember when she told you?
So she started talking to me about her experience, both her childhood experience and her Holocaust experience, around the time that I was 13. So around my bar mitzvah, partially because that year my older brother went to Poland on a school trip in Israel, the summer between 11th and 12th grade. Most youth goes to Poland for a 12-day trip to see the atrocities that happened there. And so that must have triggered a little bit of an opening of that story. And my grandmother started sharing more with us. We learned a lot more about her story than my parents at the time knew. And I'm thankful for that. At first, I would sit with her. She would tell a story or two, an anecdote. And slowly I realized what I was receiving. I actually brought in one night a small tape recorder and I hid it in my shirt. One night, another night, another night. The fourth night, she looked at me and said, "Can you put that tape recorder on the desk instead of hiding it?"
She knew.
She knew.
Did you ever witness her talking about the Holocaust shaken, or was she more resolute? And by the time she talked about it, people describe it more as a steely delivery of the facts.
Most of the time she wasn't shaken, but she was sharing with me one anecdote or another. It was never a long-winded story about everything that had happened. However, there was one specific time during Yom HaShoah, which is the Israeli commemoration day of the Holocaust, that I remember her sharing with me that she has become the age of her grandfather when he was murdered in the Holocaust. That was a very strong moment for her. That is the time that I remember her actually crying and thinking about her family.
Sadly, you have several grandparents who endured atrocities of the Holocaust. Your two other grandparent stories, you call them, quote, less traditional because they were not physically in Eastern Europe. Let's start with your other grandmother and her family story.
The interesting thing is, growing up in Israel, we had a large family on my father's side who moved to Israel with his parents and siblings in the 1930s. And so we always had a lot of family events, but it took me a long time to realize that those family events only happen on one side of the family, while other sides of the family didn't have much going on. And both my grandparents on my mom's side moved to Israel also before the war, but one moved with a single brother, that's my mom's dad, and my mom's mom immigrated to Israel legally during the British Mandate, and she was alone. She moved with a group of friends. Her family stayed in Vilkomir in Lithuania, which is nowadays called Ukmergė. The town changed its name immediately after the war. Back in Lithuania, she was involved with the Zionist youth movement and deeply believed in the ancestral Jewish connection to the land of Israel. So coming to Israel really meant a lot to her, while her family was staying behind in Lithuania. Now, her father owned a freighting company, and they owned many trucks, horses, and carts. Trucks were the newest and shiniest thing on the lot at that time. And those living in Lithuania were not immediately affected by Nazi Germany in 1939, because that phase of the war started a little bit later, about 2 years later, when Nazi Germany actually invaded the Soviet Union. I want to pause here before diving into the heart of the story and say something. There is a lot of literature and research today about how Holocaust survivors would hold back from sharing their family's fate with their children. Often they opened up more to the third generation. And this was the case in our family as well. Stories that were shared were told to an audience that was often born several decades later, in different geographical areas with different worlds of context. And so sometimes there can be a difference in the story that was given by the survivor and the story that was received by their audience. I'm sharing this because in this case, the story I was told by my parents, who heard it from their parents, and the actual story of what happened were a little bit different. And I was able to verify with documents some of the differences between the two. And this is important for reasons that I will explain later. But right now, I would like to walk you through the story as I received it, and then I will correct some of the information that I'm sharing.
And you say that sometimes they didn't share with generations. You feel that you got two different stories as they went through the generations from your grandmother to your mother to you?
So unfortunately, my grandmother on my mom's side died when I was 7 years old. So I received the story when it was already recycled through my mom. And that version that I received, I learned later was inaccurate in some of its aspects, but I was able to recover some of the details thanks to documents that I found.
So walk me through the original story that you heard and then the one that you found as you fact-checked it.
Sure. So here's my mom's version of the story based on what she heard from family. Nazi Germany invaded Lithuania in June of 1941. At that point, the Nazis were already starting to implement in Poland what they called the final solution, which was a government-sponsored systemic killing of the Jewish people in the Nazi territories, in death camps and in other means. Now, rumors about this were already making their way to the Soviet Union. So when my grandmother's family heard about the invasion to Lithuania in June, they got on their carts and the trucks and started fleeing east. My grandmother had 6 siblings at the time. Some were single, some were married, and some were married with children. And the story goes, as the entire family fled, they reached the city of Uman. And there, the adults and siblings with children decided that they want to stay overnight. And my grandmother's parents decided to stay with them. The married couples without children decided to continue to push towards Russia. That night, the story tells, the Nazis caught up with them and other Jewish refugees. They took them out to the forest outside of town and shot them in pre-dug pits. The family members that were able to push east survived, and after the war, they lived in the Soviet Union until the 1970s, and then immigrated to Israel, where they were able to live a Jewish life without persecution. So that was the story in our family for many years. And according to that, we all believe that the family was murdered sometime in June of 1941. And as I mentioned, my grandmother passed away early in my life, so I never had the opportunity to ask any questions about this story from her. And because she spoke so little of it to my mother, we were missing so much information about the siblings and basically information about my mother's cousin that died at a very young age during the war. And it always felt to me, and I'm the one in charge of the family tree in the family, it always felt to me like we're missing a branch in the family that needs to be filled.
What made you want to question the story that you had been told all these years?
In the past few years, and especially during the pandemic, today as I was preparing, I went back to the documents and I saw that most of them were in 2020. I gained a lot more experience in researching the family history and doing some digging in different archives. And I really wanted to write down the story and track down all the names of the children, especially the children that we can find. So I asked my mother to share the story with me for the 50th time, and she patiently did so. But this time I had my laptop open and I looked at a map. And all of a sudden, something didn't make sense. Uman is a city in the Ukraine that is 17 hours drive south of Vilkomir. And fleeing south would not have taken the family away from the front lines. In fact, Ukraine and Lithuania were invaded pretty much at the same time. So I asked my mom, why does she think it was Uman? And she told me that when she received the story, she was told that the family fled to Rabbi Nachman's town. Rabbi Nachman is a famous Hasidic Jew that is known in Israeli and American Jewry as someone who would call for rejoicement and happiness, even in times of great sadness, and he's very famous. Now, the interesting thing is Rabbi Nachman was buried in Uman in Ukraine, but he lived most of his life in Braslav, Belarus. So he is known as both Rabbi Nachman of Uman and Rabbi Nachman of Braslav. Braslav, Belarus is a modern 3 hours drive east from Vilkomir towards Russia, a much more likely direction to flee towards. So my mom or someone else in the family translated that piece of the story to Uman, Ukraine. But it was more likely that they were fleeing to Braslav. So that made a huge difference in the research work that I was doing, because there are not many documents available online from Ukraine. It's actually a very closed country in terms of archival materials, and I couldn't find anything about the family there. But now I had a new direction. So I searched for the family name in Braslav documents, and there they were. At the Yad Vashem database of Holocaust victims, which is available online and open for everyone to search, I found the entire family, minus the couples without children, in a list from the Braslav ghetto from June of 1941.
How does this verify or validate or negate or change this story at all?
So what it did is, first, it confirmed that the first part of the story was true. The family did flee east, and they did arrive at Braslav, which is where there is a separation between two parts of the family, because I couldn't find the couples that were married but did not have children on the list. But instead of an immediate death, the next day, by the Nazis, the family ended up being captured in the Braslav ghetto for long enough to be on the ghetto's list. I want to explain that for a second because it's not simple. So when the Germans got into those cities and they were already committing the genocide elsewhere in Poland and other places, they already had the system down. So they would close down any Jews that were in the city in a ghetto and basically prepare the situation for either sending them to labor camps or sending them to death. What's happening here is it is likely that their final moments, that their death was probably similar to the original story, because in the history of the Braslav ghetto, starting in June of 1942 and onward, the Nazis take Jews out of the ghetto and mass murder them in shooting pits outside of town, something that was called liquidation of the ghetto. But if you arrived as a refugee from another town and was executed the next day, there wasn't someone who sat down with a computer and put you in a list. You had to be in that town for long enough to be counted in the overall count of the community. And what's happening here is that the family stayed in Braslav long enough to be an official part of the ghetto. The ghetto was liquidated in March of 1943. And if you stop to think about this, that part of the family, my grandmother's family, my family, probably lived a year more than we initially thought in a new situation that didn't occur to us that they could have lived, because we thought that they were taken away immediately. So they lived in the ghetto, probably in some subhumane conditions, and yet they lived for another year. And that's very significant in the story.
Was it just that the story happened before anyone was documenting it, that you weren't aware? How did that get misreported down the lane?
I think that the simple answer is trauma. And we see it a lot. I saw it a lot with my grandparents when they did mention their family histories. They didn't want to get caught in the details. What mattered to them was that the family is gone. They're no longer here, that they were murdered. But to us, to me, to some other people in my generations that are doing this research, the pain is lessened by the fact that we did not know these family members directly. It doesn't affect us in the same way. And in fact, I feel the need to dig up as much about their lives as I can as a way of actually getting to know those people that were lost. It's a powerful moment to be able to identify that, yes, they did die. They did probably die in the shooting pits. But those children that were part of the family, for them, living for another year is a pretty significant portion of their life. And what have they experienced, for better and worse, during that year could be very substantial in their story. And in addition to that, the fact that in the list of the family in the ghetto, we also find the children's name, those that we were missing. And suddenly we were able to fill out the branch of the family tree and really make the family whole again in one place.
What did that feel like for you with young children of your own?
On one hand, none of this could bring anyone back. But to know that we can name the children in the family is an incredibly powerful moment for me. And seeing my own children grow, I do draw a sense of comfort in knowing that I have more of their story of those children to tell.
Are you pulling everything together that you've told me and putting it into a book? This needs to be in a book to be handed down through the generations.
I do need a few more hours of non-sleep every day to make sure that I get everything that I need to get done. Whenever I do work on the family history, I put it down in writing in some format. Obviously, I will need to put it all together in a clearer format because right now it's probably only Erez's code that deciphers it all. But I'm definitely putting more in writing about my grandmother in Krakow that I have many documents about, and I've been doing more efforts on the other two grandparents as well to try to make this accessible to the rest of the family at some point in time.
You've been to close to 20 countries and 20 US states. Have you ever been back to the places that your ancestors lived? Have you ever gone on that kind of journey of discovery of your ancestors?
Yes, I was actually in some of the locations. I've been in Poland twice. My first time was in the summer between 11th and 12th grade. I went with my dad with the school trip that I mentioned about my brother. I also participated in a similar trip. At the time, I can share that the experience of hopping from one ghetto site to another, to a labor camp, to a death camp, was pretty traumatic. It shows the scope of how systemic the Holocaust really was. And at the time, I couldn't connect to my family. And I remember that I told my dad at the end of that trip that as educational as it was for me to learn about the atrocities against the Jewish people, I haven't found a single thing that made me feel deeply connected to my family. Interestingly enough, a local community member here a few years ago heard me talk about my grandmother and her period of fighting the Nazis. And she asked to read a long article that I put together that was a result of the interviews that she gave me and the interviews that she gave to a Holocaust researcher in Hebrew University. I said to the community member, her name is Sybil Mervis, she's a close friend. I said, well, if you want to read this, you need to read Hebrew because the whole thing is in Hebrew. And she said, no, you need to translate it into English so that we can share it with the rest of the people in the community. And so thanks to her, I sat down and I started translating the material. And Dana at the time was pregnant with our youngest child. I sat down this summer of 2019 and started translating the whole thing. And some of the places didn't make sense, and some of the stories I wasn't sure about. And I looked at her and I said, if someone questions my grandmother's story as I'm writing it now, I will not have the tools to be able to prove it. I mostly just have the story. I don't have documents. I don't have anything to support the claims that I'm making. And she looked at me. We were both standing in the kitchen. I remember that moment. She looked at me and she said, well, you better book your flight to Krakow because when this baby is born, you're not going anywhere. And so Thanksgiving break of 2019, I flew to Poland for the second time in my life, and I spent just over a week in Krakow, Poland, digging through archives, doing tours of the places that my grandmother mentioned in her story, making sense of it all. And I came back with several hundred pages of documents of the family with pictures of family members that I never knew, and it was extremely powerful. So it was a very strong correction to the first trip.
Telling their story is the best thing that you can do to remind people this is why we're proud Jews. There has unfortunately been a rise of anti-Semitism on campus. What are you doing to keep the students that you interact with all the time feeling confident, feeling safe? And have you personally experienced any of this anti-Semitism?
You hit the nail on the head, Elizabeth. Our main concern in the past year, basically since the October 7th attack, has been to ensure that our Jewish students are confident in their Jewish identity, regardless of what's happening around them. And we do it through both emotional support, a lot of learning, and a lot of reminding them that there's many generations before them that had to defend their identity and we will continue to do so in this generation, in the next, and the next, as long as we need to. Hillel, unfortunately, has experienced several targeted incidents in the past few years. One with a person that threw a rock onto our roof during Passover, and another just this past summer, we had an issue with a person putting a bloody doll in front of our building, blaming us for what's happening in the Middle East. And we have been there with students that have experienced things and supported them through the process of working with the university, working with the police, and just making sure that they have all the backing they need to, again, be upstanders rather than bystanders as things happen, and be proud to report and stand up to hate when they see it. Fortunately, we have seen the university finally being responsive to this, and we have signed an agreement with the university where the university recognizes the importance of protecting Jewish students and their identities on campus in a way that we hope will prevent them from needing to hide their identity in public.
Last question before I let you go. You referenced your young children. Do you want to be the one to teach them about the Holocaust? Do you want them to learn it in school? Or do you want them to learn about it in Sunday or Hebrew school, or a combination?
I deeply believe that Holocaust education has to be multifaceted. And with our family, I'll start by saying that both of my girls are named after my grandmothers. In many ways, I've already started the process of telling them about the heroes that they are named after. And as they grow, we talk about the importance of looking at the family tree, understanding things that have happened to the family. The family stories will be told in different versions as the girls grow and are able to understand more of the complexities of different issues. But I do want to know that there is education happening in the schools about this, because this should not be just something that they carry in their hearts. And I want to get to a point where it is discussed in school that they can feel safe to share their family story. I'm glad that we have a Jewish community with Sinai Temple, with CUJF, and with Hillel's work that really elevates Holocaust education to a place where it's part of our identity and who we are. And that way, when the girls grow up and they will recognize that their family has directly been impacted by the Holocaust, that they will be able to continue to share the story with others in a proud way. It's incredibly critical.
Incredibly powerful. We're so lucky to have your family in our community. Erez Cohen, thank you so much for being part of the Champaign-Urbana Jewish Federation Holocaust Education Series. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Greatly appreciate it.